Okay, guys.
Happy New Year.
Make whatever noise you need to make before we get going here.
Woo!
SD on Thursday.
Okay.
See, well, they won't know what that means. They'll be like,
What?
SD.
Wait, so we have an SD.
on Thursday.
Skip.
Okay, guys,
We don't skip that day.
Okay, ethnicity.
So I got A day.
Okay.
The Sanderson.
Okay, now let's start. Let's start. Okay. So you guys, we are going to talk about ethnicity today. So first I want to say, so the test is coming up. Your next class, whatever class that should be, will be your unit exam. So I want to make sure you remember, and I've said this a couple times, Chapter 7, Chapter 6, Chapter 5, and Chapter 4, which means folk and pop culture, language, religion, and ethnicity. The religion material, we did one sort of brief lecture on that, so you need to make sure that you review that on your own. But we're going to talk about ethnicity today and hopefully kind of clarify some of the topics for you that I think are really important that you understand in order to perform well on the test, okay? So ethnicity, so let's talk about it. The first thing I want to reinforce to you guys is the difference between these two concepts. Oftentimes when people talk about ethnicity, and especially when my students talk to me about it, this is one of the things that they kind of get confused about, is the difference between ethnicity and race. And did we go through these slides together already?
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna review this with you, okay? So first of all, ethnicities are something that people share from their background and from a cultural heritage. So people who have the same ethnicity share a historical and cultural heritage with each other. What is race then? So if that's ethnicity, what is race? Nick?
Biological ancestors.
Yes, it is, just like he read up on the board, good boy, you can read, is a sharing of biological ancestry. So here is what gets kind of complicated about this. You can have a shared race and a shared ethnicity, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the same thing, right? So you could be, for example, someone who is racially, someone who has the racial characteristics, the biological connection to an Arab. So all those things that goes along with being an Arab. So racially, Arabs are a biological, it's a biological connection. Now a lot of times when people think about race, they think about appearance. And race and appearance can have things that connect them, but not necessarily. So you have to be really, really careful. When you look at someone who is, for example, both racially, like maybe their mom is white and their dad is black, well, racially they have some characteristics of African American or of African. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they look like all other Africans or African Americans. So the example that I always like to use is when you're talking about someone who is Jewish. Because you can actually be, ethnically speaking, a Jew. Jews are a religion and ethnicity, but they can also be people who share some racial characteristics as well. But you can be an Arab who is a Jew. In the country of Morocco, they have a fairly large Jewish population. But those Jews are racially people who are of Arab ethnicity. So racially they're Arab, but ethnically they are Jewish. So if you're someone whose parents are both Jews, you were born into a Jewish family, but you're Moroccan racially, and you don't practice Judaism, you could be religiously not a Jew, ethnically a Jew, and racially an Arab. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So it's a very complicated picture, and this is something people get really sensitive about. It's something that is really, really diverse, and you have to have a really clear understanding, first of all, of the things that it doesn't mean, and also the things that race and ethnicity can also mean. Yeah, go ahead.
Can ethnicity be based off of like a language?
Ethnicity and language are typically pretty closely linked, but not always.
Yeah,
it depends on the part of the world you're talking about. Like, are you thinking of a particular place in the world?
Slides for my India.
Yep.
It was
for India, yes. So if you are ethnically in a place like India, it's a really good example. I suspect when you show us your slides, you're going to show us the language map of India.
Mhm.
And then if you layer over that the ethnicity map, the lines are going to look really similar, right?
I couldn't find a map with a specific ethnicity.
Okay.
Like I could find two different like major groups.
Yep.
But there were no maps on specific.
If you go to a place in the world, like if you go to the Caucasus region, which is the region in Central Asia, it's where Albania and, no, I'm sorry, not Albania, it's where Azerbaijan and Armenia and Georgia, that region right in there. If you look at a map of those ethnicities, and then you layer over that a language map, you're going to see the map looks really similar. Because this historical and sort of cultural connection, cultural identity and language are really deeply entwined as well. One of the things that pulls language away from these ethnic groups is popular culture. And the diffusion of popular culture is one of the reasons why languages are kind of disappearing in some parts of the world. So, for example, you have people in parts of Africa who ethnically are from one particular tribe. But the language, for example, English, moved into places like Kenya and minimized some of those language groups so much that even though those people ethnically share an ethnicity and used to also share this heritage of a language that went with ethnicity, that popular culture and that lingua franca is coming in and in some cases endangering those languages. That's where we get endangered languages from. Go ahead.
When people are racist, that's like being mad against the person's like race. But
Yes.
what about if they're against the person's like ethnicity?
Oh, that's a great question. There's a vocab term we use. Okay, ethnocentrism is when you do what? Isaac.
Oh no,
Oh, okay, you're celebrating your right answer. What is ethnocentrism?
When you judge another person's culture based on your own.
Yeah.
If you think your culture's
Like
like
better.
Right, when you say that your culture is sort of the right culture, when you say that my culture, the way we do things, like if I said right now for Lakin and Nate to hug each other and give each other a kiss.
I would not kiss her.
If you were in a part of the world where men regularly, okay, if you're in a part of the world where men regularly do that, that is not something that is considered in any way controversial. In many parts of the world, that's not considered controversial. But if you view that culture as weird and wrong and gross, that is you applying sort of ethnocentrism. Or if you judge people because of that, if you say, like, you know, the way that you do something, or you know, an even better example is if you are someone who wears the hijab, a woman who wears the head covering, and you judge them because of that, that's very ethnocentric. It's to say that somehow your culture is more right. And but so racism is like that too. And we're going to talk about racism today because it's got a really big component. It plays a big part in the way that sometimes people behave with regards to ethnicity and race and just sort of global politics, which is our next unit. Okay, so this is my problem with these always. Okay, so for example, if you look at the distribution of African Americans in the United States, what you're seeing here is that races do tend to cluster. And but African American is an ethnicity, right? But it's also a racial distinction. So you can have both of those. Why do, in many places of the world, and it's not just African Americans, but also if you look at Indians, American Indians, why do people tend to cluster? Lincoln.
Because like they go to where the first people are, so that they're with the same kind of people as themselves.
It has to do with this sharing of a homeland and that historical connection. Yeah, it's where, you know, sort of your people are from. And for African Americans in the United States, what is going on here? What's the historical piece that we need to keep in mind here?
Slavery.
Isaac.
The North didn't have slavery back when
Yeah, they didn't have as much slavery. Yep, there still was slavery. Just keep that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that the North still did have certain forms of slavery. But, of course, the large amount of slavery in the United States is clustered in the South, the Southeast, And so that is where a lot of African Americans have their kind of homeland, where they have been from. But we talked in the last class about this period in the 19 teens and 20s called what? That moved African Americans north. The Great Migration. So the Great Migration, African Americans following jobs into this industrial zone. This is the industrial belt where a lot of Americans moved to. And then you also had groups of African Americans, especially in places like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and other parts of Southern California, where, again, economic forces, this is an internal migration issue where economic push factors and pull factors brought African Americans into different places. So thinking about that terminology too. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Is it true that on the north that was treated slaves better than the south, or is that
I always like to remind my students who are sort of, anybody in here grow up in the South or live in the South at any point in their lives? It's really important, I think, for Northerners to keep in mind that while we do like to sort of see ourselves as, in some ways, I think Northerners absolutely see themselves as morally superior to even modern Southerners. And Southerners get it. They know it. And the tension, there is a tension that does still exist between North and South. There was almost as much like racism in the North as, if not more in some places, as there was ever in the South during times of slavery. And what Southerners might actually argue is that, in fact, in their society, at least there was integration and communication, and blacks and whites lived within the same sphere as each other. In the North, white people have historically, especially in a town like the one you guys are growing up with, typically have had almost no contact with people of other races or other backgrounds, which could be argued, and I think it's a fair argument to make, is in some ways leads to even more racism. It's just much quieter, because what you guys don't have is the experience of hearing other people tell their stories about their lives and their experiences, of seeing the way that other people live. I mean, put your hand in the air if you have ever had dinner at the home of a black family,
for a black family, or just
where the parents were African American. Put your hand in the air so no one raises their hand, because we live in such a homogeneous part of the world. Raise your hand if you have ever had a black person in a position of authority over you. In what context?
Well, like, do you mean like
A coach, a teacher, a principal, a boss at a job. Isaac, in what context?
school.
Where and what?
School was, there was like staff members on school and middle school, I think.
Okay, when you didn't go to school in Lodi?
Oh, I did.
Okay. The custodian, yep. We had a custodian at the elementary school, but I wouldn't consider that person to be in a position of authority. Sure. But think about it. That's as good as we can do.
I
We
feel
had
like a family member, but
Oh,
I don't know
wait,
if that's
the
authority.
district.
My dad's cousin's wife or something.
okay. The point
I had dinner
But think
with
about,
Riley.
but guys, stay with me. But think about how far you have to reach to make that connection. And so we have to always keep that in context, that there are things that you don't understand about race and ethnicity by virtue of the fact that you have had so little experience. It wasn't until I was in college that I had a black person in a position of power over me. And that is a big deal. That is a big deal. Because I did not have, just like you guys, I did not have the experience of relating to someone who was a different race than I was in a way that I had to be subject to their authority. And that is something that is a privilege, right? I have very rarely in my life been in the minority, for example, racially speaking. So now there are other ways that you guys are minorities, right? There are other circumstances where you have been the minority. But when we're talking about race and ethnicity, these issues get really kind of tangled and complicated. And then if you use examples like the distribution of Native Americans, right, and talking about what has happened to Native Americans, that's also an ethnicity, and it can be also a racial distinction as well. So if you are ethnically Chippewa, that's an ethnicity, a tie to a homeland. But the Chippewa largely do not live in the same places that they once did. Or, for example, the Seminole Indians. The Seminole Indians used to control almost this entire part of the southeast in Georgia and Florida, and they're almost non-existent anymore. So what does this tell us? This map, what's the story we see about this? Right, this forced migration, this forced movement. Yeah, go ahead.
So why is there like 50% animal trying to do in one little community there, and the one right next to it is below 1%? Like down in the south and on the southeast.
So what I don't quite know if I know.
No, but like just the splotches of light.
There's like a bunch of like 50% and above, and then
Like in here?
yeah, then there's just like boom, below 1% right next to it.
Right. So what I would have to do is I would have to look very closely at those regions and see what they are. So if you look at, for example, if you look at this region right in here, this is like New Orleans. Yep. New Orleans has one of the largest urban African American populations in the United States. So you can see this is pretty dark, but we have this very light enclave.
Like a white neighborhood.
Yes,
Yeah.
I was going to say, what conclusions might you draw? Now, you don't have all the information, but if we had Google Maps or Google Earth and we zoomed in there and we looked really tight and really close and we could analyze the ethnicities there, what Nate said is very largely probably true, that we're looking at a white region, an area where, and we're going to talk about why that happens, because white people and black people and Asian people, well, not quite so much, but white people and black people in the U.S. in particular tend to do what's called sort of self-segregation. And that's historical, and it also has some like cultural components to it and why that happens. And that's all stuff we're going to talk about. What do you want to say?
With that, like, the other reason, like, as far as, never mind. I can't.
It's okay.
It's hard
If
to
it
put
comes-
into words.
If it comes back to you, ask me. Okay, I want to keep moving here. Okay, so distribution of ethnicities in Los Angeles and Chicago. So this is a great example of what I was just saying. If you can zoom in and get even closer, you can see how ethnicities, even within these urban areas, divide themselves and do this sort of segregation. Now, some of this segregation is choice segregation. What's the vocab term?
Affinity.
Yes, affinity segregation. So people do it by choice, right? But some of this also has historic roots. And the city of Chicago is an excellent example of how ethnicities have sort of affinity segregation components to it. And you can see, so the purple is African American, green here means Hispanic, the Asian in these small little clumps, and then white. Now, why would racial groups or ethnic groups self-segregate? Why would they do that? Okay, it is part of human nature. Humans just, when sociologists study these kinds of things, they find that we tend to want to be around people who are like us. Think about the lunchroom. What do you see in terms of affinity segregation in your school lunchroom?
Some upperclassmen, north upperclassmen.
Why?
Because they're more, let's say, yeah, we're upperclassmen.
Careful, then some of them might be watching this. Yeah, Brandon's in here. Careful.
Yeah, and then
Yeah, Parker.
I take that back.
Yeah, they know each other. They've built relationships with each other. They have things in common experiences, right? And they also have potentially common classes together where maybe they're talking about homework or talking about teachers. Excuse me, common friends, relationships. And the same thing is true often for ethnicities. Although if you look at a large ethnic group, if you look at African Americans, for example, those kinds of ethnic groups and ethnic enclaves, sometimes it has to do with dietary reasons. If you have, for example, a large Muslim population, they might want to live together. Why?
So on the produce, you can find all the...
Okay, foods that are
Foods,
typical
yeah.
to if you're an immigrant from a Muslim part of the world. But what do you know about Muslims and food? Because you did your reading, you should know that Muslims what? Just like Jews, they what?
Don't eat that.
Yeah, they have certain foods. What's one?
Oh, they can't eat goat.
No, they eat a fair amount of goat in some parts of the Muslim world. Yeah, pork.
Pig.
Yep. Pork, They also have rules about, it's called the halal rules, and for Jews, it's called kosher dietary rules, where you can't mix meat and dairy products. You can't eat shellfish. Now, Muslims' rules are slightly different than Jews' rules, but you can see how that might be the case. One thing I want to point out here, and so in Chicago, there's a really interesting dynamic, especially with the historic migration patterns within Chicago. Chicago was one of those cities that was a city that developed during the Industrial Revolution. A lot of agricultural processing went on in Chicago. And so you had a lot of migrant groups that came into Chicago to work in the meatpacking industry, to work in the meat shipping industries, on the railroad lines, bringing literally like cattle in from places like Kansas and southern Illinois and places like that into Chicago for butchery, and then either out through the Great Lakes or up through the Great Lakes states on rail lines. And so you had these different groups, the Polish, the Germans, the Irish, that began to cluster. Why might those groups, immigrant groups, cluster into what ultimately becomes these ethnic neighborhoods? So it's another factor that causes this affinity segregation.
So you say they're poor, there's a lot that work at the canning company
Yes.
over the summer?
Okay. That doesn't answer my question though.
No,
Why might, what's another reason that might push this kind of affinity segregation?
After that, people don't want to use something.
Potentially, what I was going to say, potentially that could be the reason. It could be because people don't want to be associated with other groups. It could be because of, sort of historic disagreements or dislikes. The German and the Irish were very famous, kind of competitive groups. But what else? Think about an immigrant population. Look at the Hispanic neighborhood here. Look at this Hispanic neighborhood in central West Chicago. What is going on for an immigrant group that might cause them to choose to self-segregate? We talked about diet. What other components?
Religion.
Religion, sure. If there is a church or a mosque or a synagogue, good. What about that church in a Hispanic neighborhood?
The type of religion
Better be which one if it's a Hispanic neighborhood?
that follows
Roman Catholic, right? What else? What else are you going to tell me about that church? That gets to this other big reason for affinity segregation.
the priest guy
I could be. The priest guy is potentially, absolutely. And so it means what?
People of power have the same idea.
Anybody ever gone to a grocery store in a neighborhood that was very, very heavily Hispanic? Say it again. What now? What about language? How about that? Is that going to be another major push for affinity segregation? Language? Absolutely. Now remember how we've talked about, and I see about 60% of the room getting it. That's not written on this board, is it? That's not written up here. I didn't write that anywhere, some of the reasons why people do affinity segregation. But if you don't have the words affinity segregation and a list of the reasons why people might do that, you're missing it. You're missing it. So, yes, language is an enormous part of that as well. But that's affinity segregation. What's the other kind of segregation?
I just have one another thing. Like,
Uh-huh.
They have like Chinatown in some cities,
Yep.
and that might be why like Chinese go there.
Yes. Absolutely, the language. I was in Vancouver last spring, and you can go. Vancouver has a really, really bustling Chinatown. First of all, tell me geographically speaking, why would Vancouver have such a bustling
West
Chinatown?
Coast or-
Yeah, I mean, look up at that map back there. Do you guys know where Vancouver is? If you don't, let's point it out.
Oh, I can.
Go up and point it out then, Lincoln.
Go away again. Turn the computer to latency.
I will, Isaac.
Don't.
We'll turn the computer so they can see. Yes. So Vancouver is going to be right up here, okay? And so that means, of course, that we have this migrant population coming not just from China but also from Japan. There's Japantown and there's also Koreatown. So depending on where in the world this particular city, where it's located, you might have different kinds of ethnic groups. I mean, that's pretty basic. But if you go to Chinatown in Vancouver, you're going to see almost all of the writing in Chinese. You're going to see Chinese grocery stores and people on the street openly speaking Chinese. And the same is true for a lot of cities in the United States as well. As a matter of fact, I'm going to show you guys that in just a second. This is a photograph of a Polish neighborhood, just looking down the street of a Polish neighborhood in Chicago. And I told you I was going to talk about Dariusz Jaworski, right? Because he lived, when he lived in Chicago with his dad, he lived in a Polish neighborhood. Why? Why do you think Dariusz Jaworski?
Because they were Polish.
Because they were Polish. And his dad, when he came to the United States, did not speak English. And so he needed to go somewhere where he could not only be with people who were like him, that he recognized, that had the same cultural heritage, but also for the language, which is a huge, huge part of it. So these are all portions of sort of the affinity segregation, sort of practice of affinity segregation. Okay, let me see if I can get clicked back. Okay, but I want to talk also about other kinds of segregation, because we have these other kinds of, what's the opposite kind of segregation called?
Forced.
Forced segregation. Here's a closer look at the ethnic neighborhoods in Chicago, and this is about 12 years ago. We can learn a lot about the history of a place. And Chicago actually is a really fascinating town. If you ever go to Chicago and you're there as a tourist and you want to do something touristy, they actually have Chicago neighborhood tours, and you can take a bus or a little trolley, and they'll take you from neighborhood to neighborhood to neighborhood, and they'll take you to different restaurants. And because of my relationship with Dariusz, I, of course, got an opportunity to see a ton of Polish Chicago. But also, Dariusz knew a lot of people who lived in the Greek neighborhood in Chicago, and we spent some time in Chinatown. So there are really very kind of cool things that you can see. But there's another picture here, and I want to go back to this map, because I want to specifically talk about the African American population in Chicago. Look at this belt of African Americans here.
It looks like an arrow.
This is a belt of African Americans that was developed not just because of the affinity that African Americans typically have to live together, but also because of past practices of segregation that existed in the United States and to some extent still exist today. This region of Chicago right here is kind of a fascinating region. It has recently been, that's not far south enough for it to be here. This is, southeast Chicago is a really bustling part of the city, and in fact, as is this region right up in here. And you can see it sort of strangely carved out. Look at this weird little carve out here.
That would have been the rich neighborhood then.
Yeah, this is a neighborhood that is extremely wealthy. So too are these sort of northern parts of Chicago extremely wealthy as well. And they tend to be white. And historic segregation practices in the United States meant that, in fact, black people were not allowed to live in some of these neighborhoods. And still, to this day, some of these neighborhoods, while we don't have this forced segregation by law anymore, there is this economic segregation that exists. Because African Americans do tend to be, especially in urban areas, do tend to be more economically disadvantaged. They cannot afford to live in some of these wealthier neighborhoods, so those neighborhoods do tend to be more white in nature. And as a matter of fact, this little region of Chicago is really fascinating. I went to a presentation when I was in Vancouver. I was there at a conference, and I went to see a man speaking about some research he was doing about education in the city of Chicago. This region used to have a ton of housing projects. Housing projects were built largely in the 1970s, 60s, 1980s, sort of the post-civil rights era, to give affordable housing to people who were poor. And a lot of those people did tend to be minorities because of the historic racism in this country. Minorities did tend to struggle economically more than their white counterparts. And so these these housing projects had large percentages of African Americans living in them. The city of Chicago, however, has wanted to bring in large corporations into the city of Chicago because it boosts their tax base. So they actually tore down public housing in this part of Chicago and brought in instead the offices and office complexes of some of these large corporations. There were, I think, like 8 major corporations that moved into Chicago in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And this is now one of the wealthiest parts of the United States because of that move. But look what has happened. It's bleached it. So you have very few African Americans living there. Go ahead.
First, you could kind of like see how they could come from the south, because like in southern Chicago, well, I don't know if that's really what happened, but it could be, because when they came from the south, they just settled in the.
That could be, although in this kind of, when you're looking that close, I don't know that you can see that specifically. It has probably more to do with the particular geography of the place than it has to do with that. But also, you guys look at some of these. This is Lakeshore, right? This is this is the lake region. These are really highly sought after.
Yeah.
People want to live near water. They want to live on lakes. They want to have beaches. And so it makes sense that you don't have the wealthiest neighborhoods aren't necessarily out here. They do tend to be closer to the water, which is more desirable. Like,
No, yeah, with the like on the map, with the Black American, down in Florida, it was mostly the under 1% along the coast.
Right, exactly.
And like another thing could be that like you see a lot of black neighborhoods near all the major highways.
Yeah.
Like in southern Chicago, because that could be just because people don't really want to live there.
Well, I'll tell you what you see. As a matter of fact, I took a great class in college called The Language of Maps, in which what our professor told us is, this is a very well-known cartographer study that they did. It's been a series of studies over years where basically what they found was that the fewer the off-ramps in a neighborhood, the poorer the neighborhood tends to be. Why do you think that is?
Because like most of the economy is based along the interstate,
Like the
and so
businesses
if you
don't
can't,
If you can't get access to it, why
You're
would
not
you
gonna
build
get
a
off the
store
ramp and
where
not-
people can't? I mean, you guys have all probably had that happen where you're like, I want to get there,
Yeah.
but where's the exit, right? Well, if you don't have an exit, then people aren't going to build a little shopping mall in your neighborhood and employ people and pay taxes. And that's a huge part of it is the tax base, because those businesses pay enormous. I mean, think about how much tax a gas station pays. Enormous amounts of taxes. And so you want business in your community. Especially if you don't have property taxes that you're collecting, which in poor neighborhoods, again, property taxes tend to be lower because property values tend to be lower. I want to show you guys a map of another city. We've been talking a lot about Chicago, but I want to talk instead about something a little bit closer to home, and I want to talk about Milwaukee. This is a series of maps that was created by a cartographer based on, by Eric Fisher is his name, based on some work that he did. And this is a map of the city of Milwaukee. The city of Milwaukee, for a variety of reasons, you might be surprised, or maybe you won't be surprised depending how much you know about Milwaukee, is considered the most segregated city in the United States. Which means that, statistically speaking, black people and white, guess which color is which?
The red. No, blue. White's blue.
Which is which?
Right?
I don't know which color you're saying. You're just saying blue. What do you mean?
No,
He said blue is white, like white people.
Opposite.
no, red is
Yeah.
Red is white people.
Red is white. I mean, think about the population of Milwaukee,
Oh,
right?
yeah. that
Okay.
makes more sense.
So black people and white people statistically
What yellow?
do not live next to each other as frequently in the city of Milwaukee as they do in any other city in the United States. And this has a lot of historic roots, and it gets to our earlier conversation about the race issues in the North that Northerners sometimes try to kind of avoid talking about. And then the yellow is what?
Hispanic.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we have so the Menominee River Valley, an area of industrial use. It also includes Miller Park, home of the Milwaukee Brewers, and that is an area that has the largest Hispanic population. So the near north side, I have a friend who teaches 3rd grade in the city of Milwaukee, and she teaches in this near north side. Now, what is the most highly sought after property in the city of Milwaukee? What would you guess?
Lakefront?
Lakefront. This is the whole Lakefront Park. This is where the art museum is and like all that stuff down here. And then Whitefish Bay. Have you guys ever been to Milwaukee? These are some of the wealthiest neighborhoods. Shorewood. These are some of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Milwaukee, and they're along this shore. And just across the highway is a large African American population. She teaches at a school of third graders. She has 3rd graders who have never seen Lake Michigan.
And there's
that close.
Why is that?
segregation.
It has a lot to do with how separately African Americans and white people tend to live within the city of Milwaukee. You see this little red dot right here?
Yeah.
That is Marquette University. Marquette University actually sits right on the edge of this very African American neighborhood. I took students last year to a homeless shelter in Milwaukee, and the homeless shelter is right about in here. It's called Hope House. And we were going to a neighborhood down here to do work at a food pantry. And Hope House, the homeless shelter, was in the African American neighborhood. The food pantry work we were going to do was in the Hispanic neighborhood. And we had 2-3 hours between finishing at the homeless shelter and starting working at the food pantry. And I needed to get them lunch. And we're on a bus. And I had like 26 kids. And we drove straight through Marquette campus. So I was like, oh, well, let's just stop at the university, Marquette University, and we will have lunch at their commons. And these white kids from Lodi, many of whom had never been to this part of the city of Milwaukee. How many of you have ever been to Milwaukee? How many of you, keep your hands up, have been down to the lakeshore in Milwaukee? Okay. How many of you have been to suburban Milwaukee to the mall?
But I've been to like the Bradley Center, which is like great downtown.
Okay, the Bradley Center. How many people have been to Milwaukee for Miller Park?
That's the only reason why I go
Yeah,
there.
for a lot of you, that's the only reason you go there.
It's
Malls,
not even downtown.
malls, yep, lakeshore, and sometimes to see a concert. But to go into these neighborhoods, so my kids from Lodi, you guys, were shocked at how this city changed. They went from a blighted city. I should show you pictures. I didn't think about it, or else I would have. These are pictures of them on that field trip. But they went from this really blighted part of Milwaukee where they saw, burned out buildings. They saw open fields just covered in garbage, and it was a very, very poor part to one of the wealthiest parts of the city, almost exclusively a white university, and it was within a matter of a mile. Boom! They were in this totally different world where there were these beautiful buildings, this super wealthy university, having lunch, and then we crossed over the river here. We ended up, boom, in a Hispanic neighborhood where by the time we got to where we were doing this food pantry delivery, there were 400 families waiting outside of this elementary school to get this free food. So this is a city that really has a ton of segregation. And I think it's extremely critical to know. If you compare it to other cities, this is Boston. Again, you can still see that segregation, especially of the black community. But look at the Hispanic community isn't quite as segregated, right?
No, they're spread out.
There's more enclaves.
DC.
Look at that.
Hispanic spread out. but
What city is this?
It's still
DC.
black and white.
Yep. DC is a really segregated city as well. Very, very segregated geographically, especially if you look at the Potomac. And once you get outside of downtown DC, which is where a lot of you guys have been, if you've ever been to DC, you see this extremely dramatic difference. Look at that.
Texas.
Yep.
Seattle.
What's
I wanna see
green?
Green is going to be Asian. Yep.
Yeah, because they have a lot of China or
Yep. Japanese.
Asian.
Denver.
A big Hispanic here.
Yep,
Yeah.
large Hispanic population. Again, still some of that affinity segregation, but not nearly as dramatic as other places.
I've been there.
Nashville, look at how much more segregated or desegregated Nashville is. You don't
Wait,
see
so when it's-
neighborhoods like this in Milwaukee.
So when it's white, is
Yeah,
that just
no.
like a mix?
Oh, that's just
Essentially?
no data. These are
Oh.
data points.
Okay.
It's really cool in
Charlotte.
Nashville.
Look at how much more desegregated the South is. Charlotte, North Carolina. Cities that we associate with segregation, racism, and then compare that to our northern cities.
Fort Worth.
Okay, but then Texas is a slightly different story.
Yeah.
They do have still more historic segregation.
Oh, geez.
That's like
That's a lot of white.
Yep.
You can see the African Americans.
Mhm.
I mean, it's very
But still, you don't see neighborhoods like this
Yeah.
in Milwaukee.
So,
Tucson, Arizona. Look at that
that.
city.
Yeah.
It is like organized roles.
segregation.
Yeah.
Very much.
And there's
Very
like
much.
that little Japanese community up on the top.
around the edge. And the Superdome is right in that.
And you want to know where Hurricane Katrina hit hardest?
the black,
Yep. And the neighborhoods that have been most rebuilt?
The
the
white.
white.
Vegas, baby.
Cleveland is pretty.
Another city like Milwaukee, right? Where we had this historic move of African Americans during the Great Migration, and yet we still maintain this struggle with segregation there. Although still, Cleveland is less segregated.
My grandma lives
It's
like.
not us.
I know, but still, I can't believe we're this far into this. I gotta move up. Okay, I gotta move quicker. This is all super, super fascinating, but I gotta go faster than this because we have so much to do. Okay, so now I want to go back.
Albuquerque is all pretty much Hispanic.
Come on, there we go. Okay, so let's go back and look at what else we have. We have so much more we can talk about here. So Chicago's mosaic. Come on. All right, so we talked about this confusion that oftentimes people have, differentiating between ethnicity and race. Biological features within one racial group are highly variable, and that's what I was saying before about how, you know, if you have someone who is an African American, think about somebody who, like, the difference, like, from, like, the features, the physical features of someone like Barack Obama. Barack Obama is a great example of someone whose ethnicity is very diverse. What is Barack Obama, President Obama's, ethnic background?
Hawaiian.
Hawaii.
He is Hawaiian,
He's African.
but is he Hawaiian ethnically?
Oh no.
Wait, his homeland is.
He's not Hawaiian ethnically. What is he ethnically? African. His dad is actually from
Is it South Africa?
Kenya.
Kenya.
His dad is from Kenya. And his mom was born and raised in, anybody know?
Hawaii.
Nope, they moved to Hawaii later. Kansas. Mhm. So he is both ethnically, his mom's ethnic background, which I don't know if it's German or if it's Irish or English, you'd have to look that up. And he is also ethnically African, Kenyan in particular. And he is from a particular tribe in Kenya. His dad was a foreign exchange student in college when he met his President Obama's mom. And yet, think about how different he looks from Michelle, his wife. And I wish I had a picture of the two of them together. Because Michelle Obama has much darker skin, right?
Yeah.
And even facially, like, her features are different. And that's what you're going to find with all different ethnic groups. You're going to find this really, even though they both are ethnically African American. Who has big ears?
Obama.
Yeah, could be.
They
But
always-
that
they
isn't
always-
necessarily,
they
just wait,
always
Isaac.
do that.
That isn't necessarily indicative of his race.
Yeah.
That is something that could
In
just
political
be.
cartoons, they always blow his ears out.
That's right. Yep, and they tend to do that. Biological classification of people into distinct racial groups is meaningless. You can't really take biology and pick it apart well enough to say, well, this is specifically this biological group. Humans are the most diverse species on the planet
Yeah.
as far as our biology is concerned. As far as our diversity of our genetics and our biology and how it expresses itself physically, we're extremely, extremely diverse. And so it isn't really effective for us to try to do that kind of separating. Although people have tried it, and historically, racism has, and racist thinking has tried very hard to distinguish people by their different racial groups. Now, we just talked about President Obama and how he looks really different from his wife, and think about how different President Obama looks from Nate Jelinek, right? Like, they look really different, and yet, biologically speaking, they are less than 1%, 1/10, excuse me, of 1% biologically different. And so even though that, you know,
It's like my
makes
brother.
up, right? I mean, think about how different Brandon and Abby look, right? Like, one's really tall with sort of medium colored hair, right? One is like sort of not short, but shorter with very light colored hair, very light skin. So, but their racial difference, their biological difference is similar to the difference that would be between Abby and Michelle Obama. But racism, what it tries to do is often tries to highlight those differences and to separate people out. In the United States, we have had a very long and tortured history of this kind of segregationist idea. We were just talking about the after effects of that. The modern impact of that has been this actual segregation that still exists within our cities, our states, our communities. Separate but equal is this phrase that references a court case. Who knows what the name of that court case was? Starts with a P. Just a little H-I-N-T. You need to know that. What is it? Starts with Plessy. Brandon's got an advantage because he took this class. Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson. But you're mixing up two cases, so you have a little bit, but you need to straighten them out. So write this down, Isaac. Write it down.
How do you spell Plessy?
P-L-E-S-S-Y. And if you don't know it, you need to get your book because it's in there. You got to know this. Plessy versus Ferguson is a case from 1896. This is, and I'm going to go fast because you guys need to read about this if you haven't already. It's a post-Civil War case in which the Supreme Court of the United States, this is an American Supreme Court, said, yeah, you know what, you can separate facilities as long as you keep them equal. The problem with that is that over the years that we're going to follow, over the next 80 years that followed this ruling, what people found is that you cannot separate facilities when there is this underlying sort of racist idea. You can't segregate them out and expect people to actually be equal. We had things like white flight from black neighborhoods. Anywhere where there were black people, white people moved out. Think about those blue and red dots on that map. Blockbusting, which was a process by which real estate agents actually would refuse to show housing to African Americans in certain neighborhoods in order to actually prevent black people from moving into those neighborhoods. Segregation in the city of Milwaukee was at that time rampant, and it has led to this heritage in that city of this very, very segregated system. In 1954, the Supreme Court reversed the Plessy decision in a decision called the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which came down in 1954. And in 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court said, separate is actually inherently unequal. That by nature of separating people, you make it unequal. And so those laws changed. But the United States is not the only place that has had this problem. And the next case study of this separation and the use of race to separate people is one that I want to spend a little bit more time on because you're probably even more unfamiliar with it. It was something that happened in South Africa. And South Africa, of course, is the southernmost country in Africa. It lies just on the bottom tip. And in our next unit, we're going to be focusing on Europe and Africa for our maps. So you guys need to, brace yourself. Actually, you know what?
What are we starting with?
Maybe we'll just do Europe. We'll do Africa after Europe. But we'll see. We'll see. I haven't decided. But I'll answer that question at a different time about the maps. Okay, but South Africa's southernmost tip. Now, let me give you a little history lesson. You ready for this? The Dutch and the English first settled South Africa in, really this settlement started in the 1700s, but really got underway largely in the 1800s. And they settled because if you look at the longitude and latitude lines of those two regions, and let me get my Let me get my pointer out here. So we're talking, the Dutch and the English, right, are these people up here. They're right up here. And if you look at the latitude of those regions, and then if you look at the latitude down here, what you're going to find is climate tends to follow latitude. And they have very similar climate zones. They are very similar in their distance from the poles. And so their climates were similar. And so it made South Africa an ideal place for people from West Central Europe, sort of, or like Northwestern Europe, I should say. It made it a good place for them to colonize. And what did colonizers want?
They wanted to be able to like grow crops.
They wanted to grow more crops, they wanted raw materials, they wanted political control, they wanted a place to dump their products once they had their products, you know, they had excess. And South Africa becomes a great place for that. And what the English were able to do was dominate some of the tribes of South Africa, and the Dutch did this as well, because of their technology. They had technological advancements, including guns, that allowed them to actually dominate those regions. Now, they are going to have a much harder time once they get into the tropical regions of Central Africa, because the tropics posed a major, major issue for Europeans, because they didn't have the resistance to disease or the lifestyle habits to live with diseases like malaria that existed largely in the tropics. But luckily for them, and very unluckily for the native Zulu and other people of southern Africa, they didn't have those same problems when they were colonizing down here. So by the time we get to the early 20th century in South Africa, it is entirely under the control of a white-dominated government and a white-dominated society. And what they did in South Africa was they passed a series of laws that formally separated blacks and whites. We had those laws in the United States that were passed after Plessy that said white people live here, black people live there. White people can go to the bathroom in this bathroom, black people have to go to the bathroom in this bathroom, drinking fountains, ballparks, movie theaters, courtrooms, anywhere you can think of was segregated. In South Africa, the segregation was extreme. This is two photographs of train stops during the apartheid era. And the system was called apartheid. And apartheid, what do you suppose the root of that is? Apartheid means a separation. And so it is this separation. So Slegs, this is Afrikaans at the top, whites only. Okay? So non-whites only. And non-whites referred to anyone who was not white. So if you were, for example, like Mohandas Gandhi, Gandhi actually, after he graduated from a university in England, and Gandhi is very famous for his liberation of what country? India. Yes, he's an Indian. India was also a country that was colonized by the British and also had really severe segregation laws and you know, a lot of oppression of people who were not white. But Gandhi was from a really wealthy Indian family. He went to a university in London, got a law degree, and he actually moved from London to South Africa because it's another British colony. And when he was in South Africa living under apartheid, he had this like realization of how wrong the system was. Gandhi actually started his fight for the equality of Indian people, not in India, in South Africa. And he was eventually kicked out of South Africa because of his activism. Gandhi goes into India and in the 1930s and into the 1940s actually liberates India from British control through a series of monumental movements that he is the leader of. And through all of it, South Africa remains stuck in this apartheid era. I have a great book that I bought once. Actually, I didn't buy it. I got it from a friend with images from apartheid South Africa, and I'll pass it around. The book is called Why Are They Weeping? South Africans Under Apartheid. And the system of apartheid was extremely brutal. It was extremely brutal, and it was very strict. And people had to have paperwork and documents. Let me show you the next. So the photo up in the upper left there is a photo of the documentation that black South Africans were required to carry with them. And they were required to carry with them this documentation that said their race, it said where they lived, And black South Africans in the apartheid system were actually forced to live, oftentimes, in places called townships. And these townships were extremely poor, we would say blighted places, where there were no jobs. The jobs, instead, were actually inside the major cities. I had a great professor in college who explained the system of apartheid and how it affected people to me in a way that was really, I felt really, really effective. First of all, what you have to understand is that, you have sort of the central city model, right? And when we get into talking about urban planning, we'll see this more. So this is like the central city. So if you think about like Madison, it's where the Capitol is, State Street. And then you typically have a sort of business ring. Yep. You have a ring where there are businesses. So you might have places like, so I'm trying to think of a good example in Madison. As you kind of come into zones where like the coal center is. Like not the coal center, I'm sorry. What's the big,
Camp Randall?
Not Camp Randall, it's the place where they have all Alliant Energy Center, right?
Oh.
So that's where you use the Beltline,
yeah.
right? And then you usually have this sort of transportation network that feeds in and out of this
Like
business in Central
the
District.
airport is. Because the airport's kind of out of, like, downtown.
Yes. And then you have housing, or you could call suburban regions. And in Johannesburg, which is the capital of South Africa, they had this same system. Most of the jobs are in this ring. And you have industry often. Now, industry now is tending to move outside into some of these areas, but industry and business is typically in here, especially if you're someone who needs a job working sort of a low-skill job. But under apartheid South Africa, if you were black South African, you did not have permission to live anywhere in here. They didn't have permission to live anywhere in this zone. And so in Johannesburg, there was another series of rings, and these were the townships. And oftentimes, to travel from the township to the inner city, you're talking about it could be a couple of hours by bus transportation, which is completely unsustainable for you to travel, especially with the expense of travel, because people didn't have cars. There are very poor transportation systems out to poor areas typically. And so what black South Africans would have to do is they would actually have to get papers that gave them permission to travel and live for short periods of time in temporary housing. Leave your family in these townships. For 3 months, you might have a work permit to go out and live in this temporary housing, and then you make money and you go back to the townships. And then you have to apply for another work pass, and then you go back. It was so brutal, you guys. It was an incredibly brutal system, and it was based entirely on race. It was based entirely on race. This existed, you guys, until the 1990s, really, when these two men, this is de Klerk is his name, and Mandela. This is Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was the leader of a resistance movement. Now, we tend to think of Nelson Mandela as kind of a hero now. But he was considered in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, he was considered a terrorist. Absolutely. He was one of the coordinators of the ANC, the African National Congress. And this was an organization that absolutely used bombings and violence to try to push back against this white system. He's called a hero now, though. But at the time, he was seen as a very controversial character. He actually spent 30 years in prison for his activities. When he left prison, he became the first black president of South Africa. And this man, de Klerk is his name, was a huge part of dismantling this white apartheid system in South Africa. South Africa still struggles to this day. It is a country that is bounding back, but this legacy of apartheid is enormous. These townships still exist. People still live in really desperate cycles of poverty within those townships, but it is something, again, that is part of the way that sometimes this kind of forced segregation can look in a society. So now I want to talk about something different. We've talked about ethnicity, we've talked about race, now I want to talk about nationality. And I always like that there's so many, I feel like the author of this book must have spent a lot of time in Denmark because there's a lot of Denmark examples, so I like that. So if any of my Danish friends are watching, yeah, okay. So, but let's talk about nationality, because nationality is different from ethnicity and race. How so? Parker, thanks for putting your hand up. How's nationality different from ethnicity and race?
Nationality is like where you live and what nation you're loyal to, and ethnicity is like your
cultural heritage,
yeah.
right? Mm-hmm. Yes. Nationality is your identification or allegiance to a country. So, people who are, their national affiliation is like Mrs. Melcher. What is her nationality?
Canada.
Probably. Yeah, she in fact doesn't have an American passport. She has Canadian citizenship. She has a green card. But if you asked her, I think she would still identify herself as a Canadian. What about you guys? What's your nationality? Yeah, the country that you identify with. What about a kid? We don't have very many good examples in our school because we're so homogeneous. But what about a kid whose parents migrate from Mexico every year to work in agriculture? What's their nationality?
Mexican.
Probably. I grew up in a community, though, where I knew tons of Mexican kids who I went to school with year after year after year. They went to school with us half a year. Were they Americans or were they Mexicans? Nationality is something that is very much something that you typically tend to choose. It is an allegiance that you declare. Could you guys declare yourselves Canadians?
Yeah.
No.
You probably could. You could say, yeah, I want my allegiance to be with Canada. But in order for you to truly demonstrate that, you might have to actually change citizenship. Okay, Nate's going to be Djiboutin. Most countries have multiple ethnicities within them. This country is a great example of that. We have people of all different ethnic backgrounds. But a nation state is an example, and Denmark is a good example of this, of a country that combines a pretty typically homogeneous ethnic group with a national allegiance. So the Danes, and this is the Danish flag on some barn doors there, the Danes are a nation state because they essentially have like one very dominant ethnic group within Denmark. It is changing. Is the United States a nation state?
No.
No, it's not. So when you look at these the examples of nation states, they do tend to be small, and they do tend to be nations that aren't very diverse. Nationalism is a devotion to a real or perceived nation. And what's an example of something that demonstrates nationalism?
National anthem or flags.
Yeah, hanging a flag. Look at that. Every morning, what do?
I
Pledge allegiance. That is an example of demonstrating nationalism. Not everyone does that. But if you do it, you're demonstrating nationalism. If you wear a baseball cap with an American flag on it, nationalism, right? If you have a bumper sticker that says, my son is a U.S. Marine, nationalism. That is an association that you choose with to show devotion or loyalty to either a real or perceived nation. Yes. What's another example?
Wait, what would be considered as perceived?
Okay, and that gets to sort of the next question. Are there people who associate themselves with a nation that doesn't exist?
Yeah.
Oh, the USSR.
Sure, there may be people out there that are sort of still kind of cling to that USSR. There are lots of good examples of places around the world. What about Palestinians?
Oh,
I am part of the specific sports team's allegiance, you could say.
Sure,
that
but
be
that's
like a-
not. I mean, sports teams are nationalism, right? But it's
No.
but you're talking about allegiance. Yes,
Some people
like
treat it like
where what you have sort of an allegiance to. If you're a Palestinian, is there a country called Palestine? Technically speaking, no. But are there people who believe that Palestine is a nation that should and does exist?
Yeah.
Yes, there are millions of people who believe that. There are millions of people who believe that a place called Kurdistan should exist, which is a place that sits right between Iraq, Turkey, and Iran.
Oh, yeah.
And so these real or perceived nations, these are nation states, by the way. This yellow, look at how you see these.
holy cow.
Mhm. What you notice is places that had heavy colonization tend not to be traditionally a nation states.
Like you were just talking about South Africa.
Mhm.
They're like
Yeah.
one
Yeah.
of the only countries in Africa that's.
Look at this. Especially the English. Look at this, the English. So,
Because Russia's a bit, yeah.
and within Europe, you can see lots of different examples of nation states.
Why?
So this gets into talking about the clashing. So then why do ethnicities clash?
Misunderstandings.
Absolutely. Misunderstandings.
They
One
have
of the
power.
biggest power. Here is the key. You really need to understand this. Ethnic competition for control over politics is a major cause of ethnic disputes. When two different groups are arguing about who should control the government or a piece of land, you tend to have ethnic disputes. Syria is an excellent example of right now a conflict that's going on, Parker. A conflict that's going. I just want you to hear this, okay? A conflict that's going on in the world. How many people have heard on the news about Syria?
Explosions or-
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Pay attention to the news, you guys.
Oh, we're
In our
going-
next unit, we're going to pay a lot of attention to the news. Yeah.
We're sending troops into Syria now.
Well, they've been
They're-
talking
no,
about
they're-
it. There
oh,
are
I
these
thought-
questions about what the United States is going to do. I don't think that we will be.
I thought last night they said they
Why
were
don't we let
I
them
haven't
work
heard
it
that
out
going
themselves?
to.
Okay, that's a different conversation. Stay with me. So, Syria is an example of a country that has a lot of different ethnicities. Look at this. These are the different ethnic groups within the country of Syria. And look at the green. You can see this is the dominant ethnic group. The man, Bashir al-Assad, is the name of the man who is the president of Syria. And he is from what's called the Alawite. The Alawites is this light blue group. What do you notice about the Alawite group?
We're not
They're
very.
very clustered.
It is a minority. The Alawites are a tribe that is the minority in Syria. And yet, Bashir al-Assad is himself part of that minority. So if you were part of this Sunni majority, what would you think about the fact that your government is being run by a man who is not part of the majority?
Oh my God.
You wouldn't like it, especially if Bashir al-Assad was oppressing and giving favoritism to different, the Alawites are much, much wealthier.
His views are going to be like.
And look at where they're located. Look at this piece of property here. Right?
Right.
Beautiful piece of property, very water-rich region in Syria. And so this has led to a major civil war within
Like
Syria.
a rich politician would vote for taxes to not be raised on.
And there's no vote in Syria anyway. I mean, this is a man who runs a dictatorship. Ethiopia and Eritrea have had ethnic disputes over land and control for decades. The Sudan actually just broke up into two countries, Sudan and South Sudan, because of this ethnic group. Who is going to control it? Is it going to be the Arab minority or the African majority in the South? Somalia, Lebanon, and then Pakistan and India. These are all examples that you need to go to the book and read through. All of those are used as examples in the book of these minority and ethnic clashes. So understanding that it is both religious and ethnic differences that sort of clash people, but competition for dominance over politics is enormous. And there's just some maps about the ethnic diversity issues. Okay. You guys need to review the information about ethnic cleansing, what that means. And this is a major case study that I did not have time to get into with Balkanization. But you need to review it, Yugoslavia, and what happened there, and what it taught us about how ethnicity and ethnic cleansing can take place. Okay. Okay, so I really need you to review what happened in the Balkans, and those examples of ethnic cleansing in particular. And one last thing I want to say, you guys, over break, I'm going to give you guys an assignment that is going to be worth extra credit, where you are going to have the opportunity to watch films about ethnic cleansing, about ethnic tensions, and different films are going to be worth different amounts of points because some of them are sort of more difficult, more complex films than others. But keep in mind, also over break, I'm going to be asking you to read a chapter of the book. Okay?
A chapter?
A chapter. You're going to read you're going to read a chapter. Yep, that's it. Just a chapter.
Geez, I figured it'd be the unit. Next unit.
The next chapter.
So how long is the
But-
chapter? Like 20 pages or 3?
I don't know. You have to look at what the political unit is or chapter is. But listen to me. Listen to me. Whatever class you have me with next, you're going to be taking the test. Come and see me. I'm here. Intervention period, after school, before school. I would love to help you because I want you all to do really, really well. I would be so. Do you guys know how happy I would be? I would sing for you and I will bring you all treats. If everybody gets a B or better,
Oh, a B? You consider
B or
it
better.
well?
Serious?
I think a B is a great grade. B or better.
Miss Anderson, how much extra credit are the
Jump.
movies worth?
It's going to depend on what you do.
And do we just have to
Okay.
watch
So,
See you guys.
wait, so if we have an SD, so it'd be like an A day that we miss it on, but then the next day would turn into an A day?
Yeah.
Yes, you would just keep going with your rotation.
I don't like that.
Well, we better have 2 stories on it if we're gonna have them.
Well, now you just said it out loud.
don't.
Thanks.
Oh.
You just wrecked it. You just
I'm gonna
wrecked
go
it.
with the S.
Bye, guys.
Yeah, but the school